We're in Exodus 34, verses 6 to 7. So let's just read these two verses together. This is what we're going to focus on. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining his love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. This is the word of the Lord. Now I wonder, have you ever met anyone and asked, so what are they really like? You know, you meet someone for the first time and they give you their name, don't they? And you get to know a little glimpse of what they're like. But have you ever asked the question, what are they really like? Today we're going to be thinking all about the character of God behind the name. So if we pop up the first slide for Exodus, we've been on a journey working through this book of Exodus, haven't we? We've been thinking about several different acts in the story. So you can see some pictures there to help us think about this story. At the beginning, we were in Act 1 and we thought about the redeeming God. The story begins in the shadows of Egypt. You've got Israel who are enslaved, they're oppressed under Pharaoh's rule, and a baby is born, Moses. Yet he's condemned to death. And so he's put into the waters and he's rescued and he's raised in Pharaoh's palace, but he grew unaware of the suffering of the people of Israel. And one day he can't stand the injustice anymore and he lashes out, kills an Egyptian and flees to Midian, a fugitive and a failure. But God isn't done. And in the wilderness, God appears to Moses in a bush that burns up but isn't consumed. And God reveals his name to Moses. He says, Yahweh, I am who I am. So Moses knows God's name. Moses returns, armed not with weapons, but with signs from God to Egypt. And Pharaoh just tightens his grip, but God promises freedom to his people. There are 10 plagues. We can probably all recite the stories. But Pharaoh doesn't listen, and the firstborn children die. But the blood of the lamb over doorposts meets us and greets us with the Passover. Then Moses takes the Israelites on a journey in this act, doesn't he? The blood of the lamb has protected all of those firstborns. They run out and get out to safety. And then they get to a point where they hit the Red Sea and they wonder what they're going to do. And what does God do? He splits the sea for them right in front of them. God shows up. Israel walks through. Pharaoh's defeated, left behind, and they praise God. But then they start to grumble. They realize they haven't got what they thought they wanted. No food, no shelter. What are they going to do? But God provides. Jehovah Jireh, God the provider, manna from heaven, water from a rock. God provides. And that's the end of the kind of first act of Exodus that we've been on so far. And then in Act 2, we saw a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? How God gathers his people around some words to help them follow their lives, following his call. At Mount Sinai, he gives the 10 commandments to Moses, laws for living as his people. Wow. A covenant's formed that's rooted in faithfulness. And then here we find ourselves in Act 3, where God is dwelling with his people. And throughout this act, God gives detailed instructions for how he is going to dwell with his people, for a tabernacle to be built. We heard last week, a couple of weeks ago, about the priestly robes and the instructions for how you must wear and dress and live. And then after all of this, rebellion creeps in. And last week we heard about how they melted their gold into a calf and worshipped it, how idols were being formed and they broke the covenant. They turned their eyes from Yahweh to their own creations. Exodus is a rescue story. It's a relationship story. It's a dwelling story. The people rebel, but God is faithful time and time again. However, I don't know about you, but when I listen to the kind of analysis of the Old Testament God that's portrayed in the world today, when I go on TikTok or Instagram, the theologians on TikTok and Instagram summarize the God of the Old Testament often as a vengeful, angry, and harsh God. You wouldn't expect a God like this to punish the failure. Like, you would expect him to go ahead and just punish these Israelites for turning away from him time and time again. But what happens next in the story is the opposite. Moses ascends to Mount Sinai and God descends towards him. He passes before Moses and declares his name, not Yahweh, the name that we've heard before, but the name that tells us about his character, about who he is. Now, I used to be a teacher before I was a vicar, and I would spend a long time during my summer holidays, before I got to know a class, planning out a seating plan. Anyone remember them from when they were at school? And your teacher would say, no, your name is that you're sitting there, you're sitting there, you're sitting there. And if I'm honest, all I had to go on with a lot of these children was perhaps a previous grade they got, not in a subject I was teaching. I used to teach art, so I'd get a maths and English grade, and I'd have to organise where they were going to sit based on their name and their grade. It didn't work well. Usually the first couple of lessons was working out, okay, little Johnny doesn't work well sitting next to little Sinead over here, so let's move them around. And then actually, little Tam over here doesn't work well sitting next to Chris, so that's not going to be a good match. Let's split them up, let's move them around, and let's work this out. Because I got to know their character. I got to know more than just their name. And here, God is revealing his character to Moses in a way that is incredibly beautiful and tells us about who God is. And I think it has something to teach us today too. Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin, and yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. It continues. It's one thing to know God's name, isn't it? But it's something else entirely to know his character. Names tell you who someone is, but character tells you what they are like. And here at Mount Sinai, God is revealing not just his title, he's revealing his very nature. Think about that for a second. For centuries, people had lived under the fear of fickle, cruel gods, gods who had demanded sacrifice, who manipulated and punished without mercy. But here is Yahweh, the creator of all things, the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says, this is what I'm like. I'm compassionate and gracious. I'm slow to anger. I'm abounding in love and faithfulness. One theologian calls these verses ground zero for the theology of God. It's like the foundational starting point and the place we just need to return to if we truly want to know God. And I wonder, do we really know God like that? So that's the question I want us to ask today. Do we really know God's nature? Do we really know his character? Not just as a concept, not just as an idea or a name on a page, but as the compassionate one who feels deeply for you, who comes towards you, who leans in and wants to know you and love you, and who is fierce and faithful to that call. He loves you, he loves you, he loves you. Because you see, the truth is, how we see God shapes how we live our lives. And if we don't truly understand who God is, we won't truly live for him. How we see God, how we know God changes how we live our lives. If we see him as angry or distant or harsh, we'll live unafraid, unsure, and trying to earn his favor. But if we know him as he reveals himself here as gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, rich in love, then we can live rooted, secure, and free. This is the God who meets Moses on the mountain. This is the God who meets us here today too. Not evil, not manipulative. He is compassionate and gracious. He is Rahum and Vihanun. Okay, can we say that together? Rahum, Rahum and Vihanum. I'm sure there is a Hebrew scholar in the room who's going to correct me on the pronunciation. But those words are important. Those words are important. This question, do we really know God? Do we really know him? Because right here, Yahweh, God, pulls back the veil and reveals himself. And it's a revelation, not just for Moses on that day on that mountain, but for us too. So these two words, Rahum Vihanun, translated here in English as gracious and compassionate, and more than just a nice sounding pair in Hebrew. Like, they're almost always found side by side in Scripture, not by accident. They don't just sound alike, but they actually shed light on each other. They help us to understand the other. They work together to give us a fuller picture of who God is. The first word, Rahum, translated as compassionate, is also often translated into English as merciful. It's deeply rooted in the Hebrew word Riham, which literally means the female womb. This word, the direct translation is talking about the female womb. It invokes the kind of tender, provocative, fierce love a mother has for her child. It's not a distant pity that God has upon his people. It's a gut level kind of love, like a feeling word, the kind of love that moves a parent without even thinking. Like if your child is crying, you will drop everything and go and pick them up and cuddle them and see to them. We see this word used time and time throughout the Bible. In Psalm 103, it reads, as a father was compassionate, Rahum, upon his children, so Yahweh has compassion, Rahum, upon those who fear him. For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. Or Isaiah 49, can a mother forget that her baby at her breast and have compassion, Rahum, on the child she has borne? Though she may not forget, I will not forget you. See the point, the way the mother feels for her baby that she has carried, the way a father is moved towards their son or daughter, this is how Yahweh feels towards his people. And this is how God feels towards you. That gut level, heart churning, compassionate love. And if you walk with God, if you call him Father, this is the kind of affection that he has for you. God is compassionate, Rahum. It's a feeling word. It's a gut-connected word, a deep love word. Then comes the second word, Vichonun. It's often translated as gracious, and in the translation we use today, that's the word we use. So we've got this feeling word, but this one's an action word. It comes from the Hebrew verb chahun, which means to show grace, favor, or kindness. It's where compassion is a feeling, grace here is a movement or an action. It's like a response. It's not just a felt love, a deep gut-wrenching love. It's a love that's expressed. Like where we see in Genesis 33, when Jacob and Esau are reunited after years of not being together. Esau runs to meet Jacob, embraces him, kisses him, and weeps. And Jacob looks at his family and says, these are the children God has graciously given me. Like literally God has graced, he's chowned me with them. Or listen to how it's used in Exodus. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge and return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has, when they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. I am Rihanum. I am gracious. Graciousness is not just a feeling, it's an action. It's the returning of the cloak. It's the not charging interest to the poor. It's hearing a cry and showing up. It's running towards your child. It is a moving action word. Rahum Vihanum. God feels for us like a mother or a father, and God acts for us. He shows up. He responds. Compassionate and gracious. And Yahweh says, this is who I am. I am compassionate and gracious. I'm slow to anger and rich and abounding in love. Now, for centuries, Israel would return to these words. The Psalms echo them, the prophets lean on them, and it's the ground zero understanding of who God is. But here's the thing. This isn't just a moment on a mountain. This is a prophecy in motion. Because the full revelation of God's character doesn't stop at Mount Sinai. It finds its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And Jesus is Exodus 34 in flesh and blood. Now we've explored how Rahim is a womb-type love, a gut-wrenching, deep, protective, tender love of a parent. And Vishanun is a love in motion, a love that acts, that intervenes, that restores, that forgives. But here's the tricky bit. We move on to verse 7. Maintaining love to thousands and forgetting wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. Yeah. At a glance, it kind of feels jarring, maybe confirming some of those TikTok and Instagram theologians' first thoughts. It doesn't seem to match the earlier beautiful attributes of God's deep compassion and graciousness, does it? But what's really going on here? Now, in the ancient Hebrew worldview, there was a deep awareness that sin, like when we mess up, when we miss the mark of God's best in our lives, it has ripple effects. Choices made by one generation affect the next. And we see this in our own lives too. We see patterns, we see addictions, we see broken relationships passed down from generation to generation. And this is not because God is vindictive, but because the consequences of sin are real. But one thing that's really important that I want us to take from this verse today is it's vital here to remember the scale of this. God's love is shown to 1,000 generations, maintaining love to thousands. This talks about, when you look at the Hebrew, like the generations of thousands. His love is big and vast and wide. His judgment reaches just 3 or 4. His love is shown to 1,000 generations, but his judgment here is recorded as 3 or 4 generations. This is not a God eager to punish or one who limits the effects of judgment, while his mercy stretches imaginably further. His compassion and his love is thousands and thousands and thousands of generations. And ultimately, in Jesus, we see this curse of sin and punishment broken. At the cross, Jesus takes upon himself the punishment due to humanity, offering forgiveness and freedom to all generations. So when we hear this part of God's character and name, it invites us to do a couple of things. Firstly, it invites us to take sin seriously. To take sin seriously, recognizing how our actions affect others too, not just ourselves. They can be passed on. Take it seriously. Secondly, to lean on his mercy, knowing his love outweighs all judgment. God's love outweighs all judgment. Now, I was speaking to someone this week who had a family where he expressed how generation after generation he'd seen neglect and care of each other. His mum hadn't cared for him well, and he'd had a father abandon him and his brother. And he could go back a few generations and see this was something that started a couple of generations ago. And one thing he really struggled with when he became a Christian was forgiving his parents. And he was studying the Bible at university. He was studying a theology degree, and he decided to write about generational sin. And he chose to look at God as God, my Father. And he tried to understand what it really meant to understand God as Father afresh. And he saw through this study the heart of God in a new way. He began to realize that his earthly mum and dad were living out of their own experiences and their own consequences of what had been done to them. And as he did this, and as he studied who God was, forgiveness poured over him. It was as though he was unable to feel any contempt towards those who'd been before anymore. And he really was not following in the footsteps of the generations that had been passed on to him anymore. God had made a way through understanding who God was. As he understood who God was, it changed everything. It changed how he saw himself, how he saw his parents, how he saw what had been done to him as he was growing up. When we really understand who God was and who God is, it changes everything. This is not a God who's eager to punish, but one who limits the effects of judgment while his mercy stretches imaginably further. So where do we see this clearly in Jesus? There's a little passage I just want to take us to in the New Testament. So if you've got a Bible or a Bible on your phone, you want to open it up. We're in John chapter 8, and we're looking from verses 1 to 11. So John chapter 8, verses 1 to 11. But Jesus went down to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people were gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But instead, Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them all, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And again, he stooped down and wrote in the ground. And at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? No one has condemned you." "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Now go and leave your life of sin." Here we meet a woman caught in adultery, dragged before Jesus by religious leaders, demanding justice, they quote even the law. They say she's guilty, she's punishable by death. Let's stone her. But what does Jesus do? He kneels down, he writes in the dust, and then he stands and looks them in the eye and he says, "Let any one of you who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, these stones just fall to the ground. They realize, actually, they can't throw a stone because none of them are without sin. And finally, Jesus looks at the woman and says, "Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she says. "Then neither do I condemn you. Now go and leave your life of sin." This is the compassionate God. Do we see it? The rachum, the deep compassion that he has for her. The vashanun, where he acts graciously. He forgives her. He gives her a new way to live. This is justice and mercy, love and holiness, slow to anger, abounding in love. Jesus isn't just echoing Exodus 34. Jesus is Exodus 34, walking among us. In the book of John, we read, "And the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, full of grace, chachun, and truth." And here's the key. At the cross, we see Exodus 34 completely unveiled. We see God's compassion meets our deepest guilt. We see God's grace forgives even our wickedness, our rebellion, and our sin. Justice isn't ignored, but absorbed by Jesus himself. Love is poured out, not just for thousands, but for all who believe. Jesus is the God of Mount Sinai, stretched out on a cross. But let me ask, what about you? Do you see God as compassionate towards you, or distant, harsh, and angry? Do you rejoice when God shows grace to the people who've wronged you? Or do you find yourself wanting to curate God's compassion or limit it? Because here's the radical truth. We cannot put a lid on Jesus' grace. He shows rachum and richanun to you, but also to the ones who we might least expect. And I wonder, as we understand who God is, if that changes how we see people around us. Just like the young man I mentioned who changed his relationship with his parents. Understanding who God was changed everything. Who are those people for you? The people you'd least expect to receive God's compassion. Maybe for some of you it's a line manager. Maybe it's someone in your family or a friend who's betrayed you. Maybe it's that person who still, if you hear their name, it just makes your chest just tighten. Maybe it's the political leader that you vastly disagree with. Or a war criminal. A murderer. An offender. Maybe it's the person that you live with and you just find really difficult at times. Jesus is compassionate and gracious to them too. So what do we do with that? Well, we come to the foot of the cross to lay down our stones. We let go of the need to earn or perform or control God's love, because we have a God who has gut-wrenching compassion, not just for you, but for those around us. He cares and he has mercy. We have a God who moves towards us. And we let the God who passed before Moses, the God who knelt down before an adulterous woman, the God who hung on a cross, compassionate and gracious, meet us again. So if you're comfortable to stand, let's just take a moment and open our hearts to receive from God. The compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. The God who took himself to the cross to die for you and for those you'd least expect. You know God's name, but do you really know him? His character, his love, his forgiveness, his grace, his mercy, his compassion towards you, and all those around. So in a moment, as the band play, I invite you, just as we heard Jesus say, let any one of you who is without sin cast the first stone. To take a moment by yourself with God. And I have a pile of stones here. And the invitation is to take a stone. To think of all the ways you've hardened God's character in your heart. To recognize afresh who God is. Gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding and rich in love. To let go of the hardened hearts, of the sin, of the ways we miss God's best in our lives, and to place them at the foot of the cross. So when you're ready, come and find a stone and just walk up onto the stage and place it at the cross.